Thanks for tuning in to Operation Revenge. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin the story.
My name is Cassandra Vale, and I have a long list of titles. Some of them are earned, others inherited, most notably cryptologist and strategic systems analyst. But it's the unspoken one that haunts me: invisible sister. That's what I felt walking into the high-security compound. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I had been called in for a job, a critical one, but the place was tense, everything buzzing around like a tightly wound clock about to explode. An international financial cyber attack had paralyzed aid systems across 3 continents. The kind of thing only experts like me could touch. The only thing I hadn't prepared for was her, Vivian, my twin sister. She wasn't the problem. She never had been. But it's hard not to notice the way the whole room reacts to her, like she's the one who holds the world's fate in her hands, even though we both know that's far from the truth. The world might rely on the tech she coordinates, but it's people like me, in the background, who make it happen. I watched her for a while. There she was, standing at the front of the command center, issuing instructions in that precise, confident tone she had mastered over the years. To everyone else, she was the leader, hands down, no question. To me, she was the one who never needed me. As I walked toward the perimeter, my boots echoing against the concrete floors, I caught her eyes for a brief moment. She saw me, then turned away as if I didn't exist, as if I was just another piece of outdated hardware waiting to be discarded. "I guess you'll be doing what you do best," she said, her voice lilting with a forced nonchalance when she finally addressed me publicly. She gave a half smile, which didn't reach her eyes. "Cracking codes and saving the day. Must be fun, huh?" I could feel the weight of every unspoken word pressing against me, the quiet accusation that I was irrelevant, again, that despite everything I had accomplished, I would always be a shadow in her world. Her team, gathered around her like loyal soldiers, didn't even acknowledge my presence. They were all too busy fixing the mess they had created, fingers flying over keyboards, eyes glued to screens. I could almost hear them in my head, whispering to one another, trying to figure out how they were going to get this right. But I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I wasn't supposed to be there, at least not according to Vivian's rules. I wasn't the face of the operation, nor the one everyone would rush to for answers. So I stood back, observed. The same way I always did. Invisible. This was going to be harder than I thought. I stood at the back of the room, arms folded across my chest, watching Vivian's team struggle with the code. The screen before them was a blur of numbers and symbols, the encrypted data from the breach origin server stubbornly refusing to yield its secrets. I could hear the sharp clicks of keyboards, the muttered curses, the shuffle of papers as they tried to piece it together. None of them understood what they were working with. The room was thick with tension. The international cyber attack had paralyzed aid systems on 3 continents, and here we were, trapped in a digital maze of encrypted messages. Messages that were meant to be read, not by machines, but by someone who could understand the nuance of culture and history embedded in the language itself. And that's where they were failing. I stayed silent, watching as Vivian paced around the room, issuing commands to her team like a general leading a battalion. I could feel the space between us growing wider. She might have been the civilian cybersecurity liaison, but it was me, the decorated cryptologist and analyst, who could read between the lines of this encrypted language. And yet, I stood there, still unnoticed, my expertise locked away behind a wall of silence. They were close. Too close, but not enough. I knew what they were missing. The encryption wasn't just code. It wasn't just a ransom demand, as some of the hired consultants were suggesting. It was something far more subtle, deeply cultural. The encryption patterns, linguistic markers, came from a lesser-known Eastern European dialect, rooted in old trade guilds. I watched one of the consultants, an overzealous young man named Brad, misinterpret it, furiously typing away, his confidence misfiring as he misread the structure of the message. His brow furrowed, and he spoke out loud to Vivian, but I could see the frustration mounting on her face. "This is it," Brad said, pointing to the screen. "A ransom demand. It's asking for money in exchange for data, for the release of the servers. I can't make out all the symbols, but it's clear enough." He sounded so sure of himself. I winced. Vivian nodded, but her eyes scanned the screen with growing uncertainty. "This isn't it," I murmured under my breath. She caught my gaze from across the room. Her eyes narrowed for a moment before she turned back to Brad. "Keep working on it." I felt the sting, the silent dismissal, that same sting that had followed me here. But I wasn't going to keep quiet. Not this time. I couldn't watch them continue down this wrong path. I pushed away from the wall and made my way over, forcing my way into the group. "I think you're wrong," I said, my voice firm but controlled. Vivian glanced up, annoyance flashing in her eyes. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" I didn't back down. "It's not a ransom demand. It's a signal for data access, something far more complicated than what you're interpreting." The room fell silent for a moment, the noise of the keyboards tapering off. I felt their eyes on me, the weight of their judgment before Vivian finally spoke, the edge of her tone slicing through the air. "Cassandra," she said with a dismissive smile, "I don't think you're up to date on this kind of encryption. You wouldn't know a ransom demand from a standard data breach." I could feel the cold surge of embarrassment, but I forced myself to remain calm. The room waited, their collective silence hanging like a weight. Then, with a slow breath, I stepped forward and pointed to the screen, ignoring Vivian's glare. The code contains more than just instructions. It's a protest, a plea. The dialect is from a region with a long history of cultural exchange, and this message isn't asking for money. It's asking for negotiation. I tapped the screen, highlighting a string of characters that, to everyone else, would have looked like meaningless symbols. "See this? This is a cultural pattern. It's a way of asking for permission, data access through mutual agreement. Not a demand. It's not a threat. It's an invitation to discuss terms." The room remained quiet, the air thick with tension as they processed what I had just said. Brad, who had been so sure of himself, squinted at the screen. Slowly, his fingers stopped their frantic typing. He glanced from the screen to me, the realization dawning in his eyes. Vivian, however, was quieter than I had ever heard her. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she cleared her throat. "All right, Cassandra," she said, her voice softer than I expected. "Let's see if you're right." I nodded and pointed at the next part of the message. "There's a set of coordinates here. This isn't the start of an attack, it's the start of a conversation." It took only a few minutes for Vivian's team to follow my lead. They worked through the encryption, their previous missteps becoming clearer as they reanalyzed the code. Slowly, the pattern emerged, shifting from what seemed like a ransom threat into an intricate map of signals, each one asking for a different aspect of access. Vivian stood beside me, her eyes now glued to the screen, though I could see the hesitation in her expression. She didn't say anything at first, but when the truth became undeniable, her lips tightened, and she glanced at me. "Well, it looks like you were right," she said, her voice flat. The relief in the room was palpable, but there was no victory in my heart. There was only a shift, subtle, but real, from being ignored to being acknowledged. Vivian didn't thank me, she didn't need to, but the whole team now saw me differently. For once, my expertise was no longer invisible. The knock on my door was soft but insistent, an odd contrast to the storm brewing outside. I opened it to find one of the tech specialists standing there, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Cassandra Vale?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes?" "We need you," he said, his words clipped. "The activist behind the breach encryption. He wants to speak with you, in private." I didn't need to ask why. Vivian had been irritated with me ever since the code had been deciphered in front of her team, and I'd been floating on the edges ever since, invisible as always. But this felt different. This was something more than just protocol or an oversight. Without a word, I followed the man down narrow, brightly lit corridors that led to a minimalist clean room. The air inside smelled sterile, almost clinical. There were no personal touches, no decoration, just a glass table and two chairs facing each other in stark contrast to the heavy technological chaos outside the room. I had barely stepped inside when he gestured to the empty seat across from a man who sat with his back to me, his fingers steepled in front of his mouth. "Thank you for coming," he said in a low, gravelly voice. I didn't recognize him, but I could sense he was important. His presence was like a current in the room, a silent force. "Why me?" I asked, taking the seat opposite him. "I don't trust their interpretation," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "Vivienne's team. They can't read the language beneath the encryption, but you understood it." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I saw something in them. A recognition. A depth that told me he wasn't just talking about code. "I want you to work with me directly," he continued. "No more middlemen, no more bureaucracy. Just you and me. Your skills are needed, Cassandra." I didn't hesitate. This was a turning point, a moment that could change everything. But what surprised me was how easy it was to agree. I didn't have to weigh the decision, I just knew. All right, I said, my voice steady. I'll help you. He nodded, his lips curling into a subtle smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Good, he said, and then paused for a beat, as if deliberating. One more thing. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. I need to make sure you have full clearance. You're off the system analyst roster. Officially removed? Vivian's response to your involvement will be clear. I felt a flash of surprise, but I didn't let it show. You're removing me from the list? Only temporarily, he clarified. Vivian can't know the full extent of what's happening yet. She's too narrow in her thinking. But I know you. I know you'll understand what this means, and you'll be able to help in ways she can't even begin to comprehend. I nodded, the weight of his words settling in. Behind me, the door slid open again, but it wasn't Vivian. It was the specialist who had brought me here, and I could see the unease written on his face. Everything's set, he said, glancing quickly between us. Without further ceremony, the activist stood up. He extended a hand, and for the first time, I saw him not just as a distant figure, but as someone who needed me. Someone who recognized my abilities, not just as a cryptologist, but as a woman who had been overlooked, dismissed, and misunderstood for far too long. I'll see you in the field, Cassandra. This mission, it's bigger than you think. I took his hand, the grip firm but brief, the weight of the unspoken understanding heavy between us. Vivian wouldn't be happy about this, but that was a problem for later. Now I had a new role, and this one I would own. I'd learned to listen long before I became an expert in cryptography. In fact, most of my life had been spent in silence, hearing things that weren't meant to be heard, feeling the things that others thought they could hide. That's what made me good at this, decoding not just the words, but the spaces in between them, the things left unsaid, the pauses, the cultural nuances hidden beneath layers of encryption. People often think the code is the hardest part, but it's the silences that speak the loudest. That night, I overheard Vivian and her deputy in a quiet corner of the compound. Their voices were hushed, but the tension in their words was unmistakable. You can't let her continue like this. Vivian's voice was sharp, low. She's too procedural. She's military, not civilian. It's getting in the way. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I had known Vivian didn't think highly of my methods, but to hear her say it out loud, to hear her accuse me of being a liability in such a direct way, it hit harder than I expected. She's not one of us, her deputy replied, his tone almost sympathetic. She's too rigid, too by the book. I don't see how she fits into this environment. We need flexibility, adaptability. And we need to show her why she doesn't belong here, Vivian added, her voice colder now. Her experience doesn't translate. If we keep letting her get involved, she'll only slow us down. I stood motionless in the hallway, listening, my pulse hammering in my chest. They weren't just talking about me, they were plotting to shut me out completely. But something inside me hardened, a quiet resolve forming. I wasn't going to confront them, not yet, not in the heat of the moment. I was going to make sure they knew just how wrong they were. I slipped away, my mind racing. I couldn't just leave things as they were. But if I confronted Vivian now, it would only escalate things. No, I had a better plan. Back in my room, I pulled out my encrypted audio recorder. I'd been trained for moments like this, when words were more dangerous than any physical confrontation, when silence itself could be weaponized. I replayed the conversation in my head as I recorded, documenting every word. This wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about remembering the strategy, the layers of tension and power plays that were building between us. The next morning, as the first light of day filtered through the blinds, I revisited my earliest field notes, notes from a time when I had been deployed in post-war zones, decoding messages hidden beneath trauma and suffering. Back then, it was all about finding the meaning in the silences. People didn't just speak their pain, they encoded it, buried it beneath layers of fear and caution. I had learned how to listen, how to see the words that weren't there. And now, in this high-tech, high-stakes world of digital warfare, I realized something that hit me harder than anything I had encountered in years. My true strength wasn't in flashy code breaking. It wasn't in the thrill of cracking a tough encryption. It was in listening for meaning beneath the surface. I wasn't the problem. Vivian and her team were the ones who were too focused on the obvious, too eager to push forward without understanding the deeper context. I knew what I had to do next, but not yet. Not while the air was still thick with their expectations and undercurrents of animosity. I was going to make sure they knew my worth, not by fighting them directly, but by letting them see the consequences of their actions when I was no longer in the shadows. Silently, I saved the recording. A cold and deliberate decision. The game was shifting. I wasn't just part of this operation anymore. I was going to show them just how much they needed me. It was the middle of the night when the first system failure hit. The hum of activity in the compound stilled, replaced by urgent voices as medics and logistics crews scrambled, trying to access the financial ledgers that would ensure aid distribution. The failure was swift, absolute, and it was Vivian's mistake. I had been right. The key she had submitted, the outdated one, had already been corrected, a version I'd updated hours ago. But somewhere in the mix of chaos and high-stakes decision-making, Vivian had ignored my input, choosing to run with the flawed data instead. I stood quietly in the back of the debriefing room, watching Vivian try to regain control of the situation. But the longer she tried to explain away the malfunction, the more the room vibrated with tension. People were starting to panic, their frustration rising as they realized they couldn't access the financial systems needed for global relief payments. And then, in an act of desperation, Vivian did what she always did when things went wrong. She blamed it on my team. This failure, she said, her voice sharp as she addressed the group, was due to military interference. Cassandra's team did not synchronize the data keys as expected. The issue lies with their lack of adherence to protocol. The words stung, but they weren't unexpected. I'd seen this play before. Vivian was cornered, and in her mind, throwing me under the bus was the easiest way out. But I wasn't about to let her frame the narrative. Not this time, not when the truth was so clear. I waited for a moment, watching as her words sank into the tense silence of the room. People were whispering now, shaking their heads, uncertain of what had actually happened. The blame was already falling on me. And then, finally, I stepped forward. "Vivienne," I said, my voice calm but deliberate. "That's not true." She turned, her eyes narrowing as she saw me walk toward the front. "I've already corrected the data," I continued, pulling the updated key from my tablet and walking over to the director. "Here it is, the correct version. And you'll see, if you compare it, that it matches the one I provided earlier. Your mistake was using the outdated one." I placed the tablet in front of him. The director, Maddox, glanced at the screen and then at Vivian. Without rebuke, he turned back to me, his expression neutral but with an air of quiet authority. "Walk with me." There was no fanfare, no applause, no acknowledgement of my correction. But it didn't matter. The room had shifted. I could feel it in the stillness, in the way people had started to look at me with a new level of respect. Vivian was still standing there, her gaze hard, but she didn't argue. She couldn't, not with the evidence laid bare for everyone to see. The damage she had tried to pin on me was undone with a single act of calm, quiet clarity. As I walked out of the room with Maddox, I didn't feel victorious. I wasn't interested in taking Vivian's place. But I did feel something else, something deeper. For the first time in this mission, I wasn't invisible. The emergency summit was called on short notice, an all-hands meeting of key stakeholders. Vivian had once again taken the lead, and I had been told to attend, but only in a quiet background capacity. The air in the conference room buzzed with the sense of urgency that had gripped the compound since the cyber attack. Everyone present was here to solve a crisis, and the walls seemed to press in from every side, weighed down with the weight of expectations. I could see Vivian at the head of the table, leaning into the microphone, her posture impeccable, her voice calm but with that professional sharpness that usually served her well. She'd always had a way of commanding the room, turning heads, building confidence. But today, something felt different. The activist was seated on the opposite side of the table, his body language tense, as though he was containing a storm just beneath the surface. The encrypted code, the protest messages. It was clear he had come to make his case known, not just about the data breach, but about a bigger issue that no one had dared to address until now. Vivian was presenting her version of the situation, but as I listened, I felt the frustration building in me. She was glossing over the deeper meaning behind the activist's encryption, downplaying its significance. She was getting it wrong, and with each passing word, the temperature in the room seemed to rise. Vivian cleared her throat, her words flowing smoothly. The delays in the systems are being worked on, but unfortunately, it seems like the issues stem from technical setbacks that were not anticipated. We've had to slow down the negotiations to sort through these complexities, but I assure you, everything is being handled. I could feel the activist stiffen. He was biting his tongue, clearly annoyed by the misrepresentation of his message. He had never said anything about technical delays, not in the encrypted language he'd crafted. But Vivian was glossing over it, attempting to make it sound like a mundane system failure, when the real issue was far more pressing. Cultural disrespect, miscommunication, a demand for dialogue, not delay. When Vivian paused, expecting someone to pick up on her words, I could see the anger bubbling in the activist's eyes. The silence in the room hung heavy, and I knew I had to act. This wasn't just a technical error, this was a diplomatic one. I stood up slowly, the quiet click of my heels against the polished floor echoing as I approached the table. Vivian's eyes flicked toward me, her expression unreadable, but I could feel the shift in her. This wasn't a confrontation she had expected, not from me. "I'm sorry, Vivian," I began, my voice clear but not raised, my words cutting through the tension. "That's not what this is about." The room went quiet, all eyes on me. I could see the uncertainty flash across Vivian's face. She didn't want to acknowledge it, but I wasn't going to back down. "The encryption you've been interpreting as a delay is actually a cultural protest. The activist isn't asking for systems to be fixed. He's asking for respect. The message isn't about technical problems. It's about being misrepresented, about how his community's voice is being ignored." I turned to the activist, nodding slightly. "You're asking for a negotiated solution, not a delay. And this message is not just about systems. It's about ethical considerations and the recognition of the group's needs. This isn't a technical issue. It's a cultural and diplomatic one." I could see the surprise on Vivian's face, followed by a flash of irritation. She was struggling to keep her composure. The room was silent, everyone processing what I'd just said, the weight of the misunderstanding now painfully obvious. The activist stood up slowly, his expression softening slightly. He nodded to me, his voice calm but firm. "She speaks for us now," he said, his eyes locking with mine. And with that simple declaration, everything shifted. My role here had been altered in a matter of seconds, from the ignored cryptologist to the indispensable translator. I wasn't just a participant anymore, I was part of the conversation. Vivian remained silent, and the director, who had been listening quietly, cleared his throat, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Thank you, Cassandra. That was the insight we needed." As I returned to my seat, I could feel the weight of the room shift again. Vivian's earlier authority had slipped. She might have dominated the conversation before, but now she seemed unsure, her grip on control loosening. The meeting went on, but the energy had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't the background player. I had spoken up when it mattered, and I had been heard. For the first time since I arrived, I felt like my presence was validated, not just tolerated. I glanced at Vivian as the meeting concluded, our eyes meeting for a brief, charged moment. She didn't say anything, but I could see the calculation behind her gaze. She wasn't done yet, but neither was I. The game had changed, and this time, I wasn't stepping back. The atmosphere in the conference room was suffocating, a mix of uncertainty and rising tension. I sat quietly, waiting for Vivian to finish her speech to the newly appointed Cyber Operations Director, Maddox. Her voice echoed with practiced authority as she laid out her plans for the next phase of the mission. But her words were nothing more than background noise now. I had already seen the cracks in her leadership. Maddox, a seasoned director with a reputation for decisiveness, nodded as Vivian spoke, but his eyes kept flicking toward me. The shift was palpable. I had made my case clear, and Vivian had failed, at least for now, when it mattered the most. Vivian's gaze never left the floor. She was already aware of the mounting doubts in the room, the slow loss of control. I could feel it too. "I'm concerned about the chain of command," Vivian said suddenly, her voice cutting through the air, hard and defensive. "Cassandra isn't officially in the NGO hierarchy. She has no right to make decisions without approval." Maddox turned his attention toward me, his face impassive but his eyes searching. He could see what had unfolded over the past days, and now he was seeing the larger picture. Vivian's self-assured persona was cracking under pressure, and it was clear who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. Without saying a word, I reached into my bag and pulled out the recording device. Vivian froze as I set it on the table in front of her, letting the weight of her earlier conversation with her deputy hang between us. Vivian, let's talk about your concerns regarding my role, I said, my voice even. I pressed play, the conversation from the night before filling the room. Her words about me being too procedural and too military. Her scheme to isolate me was laid bare for everyone to hear. I saw Maddox's eyes harden, and Vivian's face blanched. She tried to mask it with a cough, but the damage was already done. Her attempt to undermine me, to push me aside, had been exposed. I didn't, Vivian stammered, but the words faltered. Maddox raised a hand, silencing her. He turned to me, then back to Vivian, his expression unreadable. We should have seen her a long time ago, Maddox said simply, and the words felt like the final nail in Vivian's leadership coffin. The room was still, everyone waiting for his next move. Vivian's shoulders slumped, the weight of her actions too much to ignore now. She wasn't a leader anymore, not to the team, not to the director. She had lost control, and in her desperation, she had handed me the reins without even realizing it. Vivian, I'm afraid you're no longer in charge of the operation, Maddox said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. We'll need to find another role for you. I watched as Vivian's face flushed with rage, her fists clenching at her sides. But there was no one left to fight for her. No one left to deflect blame. The room now belonged to me. As Maddox turned to address the others, my eyes met Vivian's. For the first time, she wasn't standing tall, issuing commands. She was sitting, powerless, unrecognized, just like I had been. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like the one who had won, but I did feel something more substantial. This was mine. This was real. The fight for recognition, the fight for a place in the room, was finally over. The fight for my own voice was no longer silent. The morning after the summit, I found myself walking through the compound, a quiet calm settling over me. I had assumed control over the operations, and things were moving smoothly in a way they hadn't been for months. But there was still the matter of Vivian, her fate, the decision on what would happen to her in the aftermath of everything. It wasn't just about what she deserved. It was about what I believed was right. I'd been invited to a closed-door meeting with Maddox. There, sitting across from me, he leaned forward, his fingers pressed together in quiet deliberation. You've handled things with great tact, Cassandra, he said, his voice steady. But what do you think should happen to Vivian? I felt the weight of the question, but it wasn't something I had been blindsided by. I knew it was coming. Everyone wanted a decisive answer, something that would feel like justice, a demotion, a punishment, a slap in the face for her arrogance. But I couldn't bring myself to recommend termination. It wasn't that I didn't feel her mistakes had been severe. They had been, and in many ways, she had betrayed not just me, but the people she was supposed to be working for. However, I couldn't ignore the fact that her journey had been shaped by pressures far beyond the scope of what anyone truly understood. There was a deep sadness in how she chose to wield power, how she drove herself into that isolated space, constantly trying to prove herself better than the world that had overlooked her, just as it had overlooked me. She shouldn't be terminated, I said, the words quiet but firm. Vivian has the skills, but her approach? It's wrong for the mission. A lateral reassignment, perhaps, a role in logistics, no public-facing position, no leadership. Maddox was silent for a long moment, considering my words. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. Finally, he nodded, the decision made. Logistics, a place where she can still contribute, but not control, he murmured. I'll make the arrangements. I nodded, grateful he saw the logic, but also something else, mercy. It wasn't about revenge. It was about seeing the humanity beneath Vivian's cold exterior, the same way I had learned to see mine. She wasn't an enemy, just someone who had lost her way. The next morning, I passed Vivian in the hallway. She was on her way to her new role, no longer the leader she once was, but someone quietly working behind the scenes, without the spotlight she had once demanded. Our eyes met for a brief moment. Neither of us spoke, but there was a silent understanding between us. I had spared her, not because I was weak, but because I knew what it felt like to be invisible. I had learned the hard way that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is endure quietly, accepting the weight of your own mistakes while still working for a greater purpose. Vivian didn't acknowledge me as she walked past, and I didn't stop to watch her go. There was no triumph in my heart, only a quiet sense of resolution. I wasn't just leading operations anymore. I was leading with precision, with the understanding that true leadership wasn't about dominance. It was about mercy. And sometimes, even in the face of personal betrayal, it was about giving the other person the chance to grow. The next few weeks unfolded with a calm efficiency that was almost uncanny. The crisis was still there, and the digital breach was being methodically unraveled piece by piece. But in the background, I could feel the team's respect for me growing, solidifying, not because of some grand gesture, but because I had proved that true leadership wasn't about making noise. It was about listening, about hearing what others weren't willing to say. Vivian's reassignment had been difficult for her, I knew, but I also knew that the path she had been walking wasn't one I could force her to abandon entirely. She would have to find her own way, just as I had. One morning, I passed her in the hallway again. This time, she was sitting quietly at her desk, her eyes focused on the screens before her. I didn't say anything, and she didn't look up. It was as if we were two different people now, not rivals, but two women who had learned different lessons. She would learn hers in silence, just as I had. We didn't need to speak. We both understood what had happened, and what we had both learned from it. The compound had become quieter, almost too quiet. With the primary systems slowly coming back online and the global relief operation back on track, I found myself with time on my hands. Time I used to organize everything that had transpired, everything I had learned. The cryptographic layers, the cultural implications behind the code, the negotiations, the personal stakes. I had compiled the annotations, deconstructed the encrypted messages, and written out case notes. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for me to just be involved in solving the crisis. I needed something more, something that would outlast the immediate task at hand. I needed to leave something behind. The idea came to me slowly. A protocol, something that would help those who came after me. A manual that could guide future officers in understanding the silent messages buried beneath the surface, in reading between the lines where others only saw data. It wasn't just about decrypting code. It was about understanding context, culture, and the emotional subtext embedded in every line. I spent days compiling my work. It wasn't about credit. It wasn't about recognition. It was about creating something lasting, something that could serve as a foundation for those who would need it in the future. I wrote up the protocols for identifying hidden meaning within encrypted messages, outlining the steps for deconstructing the cultural subtext often overlooked in high-stakes digital communication. I titled it The Language of Signal and Silence, a reminder that sometimes the most important messages are the ones left unsaid. It wasn't long before my proposal was finalized. I sent it off unceremoniously, leaving my name out of the official document. The last thing I wanted was for anyone to think this was about me. It was never about me. It was about making sure others could pick up where I left off and continue the work in ways that I never could. Months passed, and I was sitting in a coffee shop scrolling through a secure file on my tablet when I noticed a slim, classified manual slip into my inbox. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the title, The Language of Signal and Silence. I hadn't expected it to be published, at least not this quickly, but there it was, now an official resource. I smiled quietly to myself as I opened the file. It was exactly as I had envisioned it. The protocols, the case studies, the detailed breakdown of cultural encryption, all of it was there. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly it would gain traction. I saw it marked as required reading for conflict communication officers, and I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. This wasn't just a technical tool. It was a guide to seeing the unseen, to reading between the lines of conflict, to listening when everyone else was talking over one another. I set the tablet down for a moment, leaning back in my chair. A soft hum of conversation surrounded me, the clinking of cups and the rustling of papers filling the air. As I glanced around, my eyes fell on a young woman at a nearby table, her face half lit by the glow of her tablet screen. She was reading the manual, The Language of Signal and Silence, murmuring fragments of code under her breath. For a moment, I froze. She didn't know it, but she was reading my work. She was learning from it, studying it. I stood quietly, my footsteps soft as I walked past her table. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of my mouth. She didn't know who I was, and I liked it that way. I was just a shadow to her, a quiet presence behind the lessons she was absorbing. As I moved to the door, I paused. The young woman looked up, catching my gaze for a brief moment. Her eyes widened as she recognized something familiar in the moment, something unspoken. I gave her a small nod, then stepped out into the sunlight. She went back to her tablet, and I walked away, knowing that my influence, my contribution, was now something that could ripple out into the future. It wasn't about making a mark, but about knowing that the work would continue. The lessons I had learned in silence, in being overlooked, in decoding what others couldn't see, would now be passed on to the next generation. As I walked down the street, the world seemed just a little bit quieter, a little more open. The Global Cybersecurity Mediation Summit was held in a sprawling conference hall, its walls lined with screens flickering with real-time data, its atmosphere charged with a palpable sense of urgency. Leaders, experts, and officials from around the world filled the room, each one representing their country's stake in the international effort to secure digital infrastructure. The air was thick with discussions, negotiations, and high-stakes deliberations. I stood at the back, watching it all unfold. This was the same world that had once dismissed me, a world where I had been invisible, a mere bystander to the action. But today I was part of the conversation, not just listening, but speaking, my voice now carrying the weight of authority. As I made my way to the front, the room went quiet. They all knew who I was, but they still had to adjust to the idea that the quiet background player was now in charge. I could feel their eyes on me, some curious, some skeptical, but all listening. I began my keynote, my words steady and measured, but the truth of them resonated in the room, deep and unwavering. We live in a world where we are constantly bombarded with data, numbers, facts, figures, but it is the silent messages, the subtext of communication, that often hold the most weight. Our systems are designed to handle the obvious, but it is the invisible that truly matters. It is the quiet voices, the ones often overlooked, that carry the real power. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. I wasn't here to prove myself. I wasn't here to show off my technical skills or solve the crisis in front of me. No, I was here to remind everyone of something they had forgotten, that the truest form of leadership isn't the loudest voice in the room, but the ability to listen when everyone else is speaking. The world will always tell us what it wants to hear, but true understanding comes from listening to what's left unsaid. The language of silence is often the hardest to decode, but it is also the most telling. As I spoke, I noticed a young woman sitting at the back of the room, her eyes focused on me, her pen scribbling furiously in her notebook. I had seen that look before, the same one I had once worn, the look of someone who had just heard something that changed everything. When I finished my keynote, I walked off the stage to the hum of quiet applause. I had said what needed to be said. And I had said it without bragging, without fanfare, just truth. But as I moved through the crowd, a familiar voice stopped me. "Excuse me, are you Cassandra Vale?" I turned to see the young woman from the back of the room. She was standing there, her eyes wide with curiosity, awe even. I enlisted because of your story," she said, her voice almost breathless. "Your approach, your way of seeing things, it changed how I think about leadership and communication. You've inspired me to pursue this path." I smiled, a warm, genuine smile that felt like it came from the very core of me. "Write it all down," I said, pulling out a pen from my pocket and handing it to her. "Especially the parts no one else sees. That's where the truth lies." She nodded, her grip on the pen tight, her eyes alight with the fire of new possibilities. As I walked away, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from the recognition, not from the applause, but from knowing that my story had inspired someone else, someone who, like me, had felt invisible, someone who now understood that the true power of leadership comes from listening, from interpreting what others overlook. I stepped out into the open air, the weight of the past and the future, both heavy in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't a footnote in someone else's story. I wasn't a shadow in the background. I was the voice that others listened for. And as the sun dipped low, I walked forward, into the future, not as a side note, but as a leader who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the most powerful message is the one we don't speak.